The night air trembled as the hum of engines grew louder, distant lights crawling like fireflies along the edge of the valley. The colonel crouched low, his pulse steady, but his mind racing, every instinct warning him to move. Yet he stayed frozen, watching her silhouette outlined by the moon. Her rifle lay steady across the sand, the scope glowing faintly as her eye never left the horizon. She whispered something too soft to catch the kind of words a soldier says when no one is meant to hear them, and the colonel realized this was not just a mission to her. It was a reckoning. The convoy descended into the ravine, headlights cutting through the dust, the lead vehicle armored and silent. The colonel recognized the pattern of movement, disciplined, professional. This was no ordinary patrol. It was extraction or elimination. Either way, the stakes were higher than he had thought. He looked at her again and saw the faint twitch in her jaw, the sign she had found her target. Her breath slowed her. Finger brushed the trigger just once, like a habit, not a choice. He moved closer, whispering her name, but she didn't answer, didn't even flinch, as if she was part of the desert itself. Her focus was absolute, the kind of stillness that came only from years behind the scope. He could almost see the reflection of the convoy in her eyes, and for a moment he understood that this was never about orders or medals. It was about one unfinished line in a story written long ago, a mistake she refused to leave behind. The first shot cracked through the night like lightning. The sound rolled across the valley, a thunder that echoed through stone and sand. The lead vehicle lurched to the side, a tire exploding, shards of metal spinning into the air. Soldiers poured out shouting, forming defensive lines, their flashlights sweeping the cliffs, searching for the unseen shooter. The colonel pressed himself flat against the ground, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. He turned toward her, but she was already reloading, calm, precise, her motions practiced and deadly. Then he saw it through the dust. One figure breaking from the convoy, darting toward cover, moving faster than the rest. It was him, the man she had believed dead all those years. "Hey, go!" The colonel's heart stopped as recognition washed over him. The way the man moved, the way he scanned the horizon, all of it matched the mission file, the impossible survivor. The colonel called out, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of engines and the rush of the wind. She didn't hear him, or maybe she did, and chose not to. Her scope followed the man as he ran, ducking behind a boulder, his shadow flickering with each muzzle flash. She adjusted her angle, her hands steady, but her breathing uneven, the rhythm faltering. For the first time, she whispered his name, the name she was never supposed to say again, and her finger hesitated above the trigger. The colonel saw her conflict play out in silence, the part of her that had lived as a soldier fighting the part that remembered being human. The man shouted something in return, his voice faint, carried by the wind, but the tone unmistakable. It was not anger, not fear. It was pleading. The colonel could not make out the words, but she could, and that was enough. She lowered the rifle slightly, not fully letting go, but just enough that the moment teetered between vengeance and forgiveness. The engines roared again, more vehicles closing in, the convoy tightening its formation. They were about to retaliate. The colonel reached out slowly, his voice low and measured. "You don't have to finish this," he said. But she didn't turn, her eyes still locked on the man below. "You don't know what I have to finish," she answered her, voice like stone cracking under pressure. And then another sound tore through the night, a sharp whistle followed by an explosion of dirt and fire near their position. The convoy had opened fire. Shrapnel tore through the rocks, sand exploding around them. The colonel dragged her down behind the ridge, his shoulder slamming against the stone, the air thick with smoke. She clutched the rifle close, her knuckles white from the force of her grip. He saw the faint glimmer of tears in her eyes, though. Her face remained unreadable. She had not fired again, but the decision still hung heavy between them, suspended in the chaos. He grabbed the radio, switching frequencies until static broke into a faint voice. Friendly forces inbound 5 minutes out. The colonel knew they had to move before the next barrage hit, but she didn't budge. She kept her eyes on the ridge where the man had vanished. Her jaw set, her breath shallow. He wanted to pull her away, to force her to live past this moment. But he knew she wouldn't leave until she had seen how it ended. Another flash of movement caught his eye. The man climbing the opposite slope, heading straight toward them. The colonel felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. Like gravity, he stood raising her rifle again, not aiming, just holding it across her chest. The man stopped halfway between them, his hands raised slowly, and in the eerie silence that followed, it was as if time folded back years into the desert. She took a step forward, her voice breaking the stillness. "You should have stayed dead," she said, not in anger, but in disbelief. The colonel could hear the convoy regrouping behind them, the faint metallic grind of weapons being reloaded, and still neither of them moved. She looked down at her rifle, then back at the man, her eyes softening with something like sorrow. The colonel felt the wind shift, the smell of smoke and metal mixing in the air, and knew whatever came next would change everything. Then the man spoke just 2 words, barely audible but enough to make her freeze. He said, "It's done," and the look that crossed her face told the colonel that there were truths buried in this mission, deeper than any report had revealed, truths that neither side was ready to face, as the next volley of fire ripped through the valley. The night was on fire again, red streaks cutting through the black sky, smoke twisting into the wind, the air filled with the echo of ricochets and shouted orders. The colonel pressed himself against the ridge sand, stinging his face as the next barrage rolled over them like thunder. He turned toward her, shouting something, but his voice vanished beneath the roar. Her eyes were fixed on the slope where the man had stood moments before, but he was gone, swallowed by smoke and flame, and for the first time her hands trembled just slightly around the Chaytak M200 that had never failed her. She dropped to a knee, loading another round, but her movements were slower now, not from hesitation, but exhaustion, the kind that crawls into the bones after years of carrying ghosts. She glanced toward the colonel, their eyes meeting briefly in the flickering light of tracer rounds. He could see the truth there. She wasn't fighting for command or duty anymore. She was fighting to understand what had really happened that night, years ago, when one shot made her a legend and broke her life in the same heartbeat. The ground shook as a blast hit close, sending dust over them both. The colonel reached for her, pulling her down as debris rained from the ridge above. She resisted for only a second before ducking low beside him, her breathing sharp, her jaw set. He shouted over the chaos, asking what the target had said, but she didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the convoy, below her lips forming words he could barely make out. "They are not extraction. They are cleanup." The colonel froze, realizing what she meant. The vehicles were not there to save anyone. They were there to erase something or someone, maybe both. It made sense. The silence, the radio blackout, the lack of coordinates command had sent them to finish what had been left undone to make sure no witnesses or evidence remained. The man she had tracked, the one she believed she had killed before, must have known something big enough to bury in the desert twice. She raised her rifle again, the barrel steady against the ridge, her eyes cold but clear, the uncertainty gone, now replaced by something harder, resolve pure and dangerous. She scanned the convoy below, each vehicle perfectly aligned, methodical, as if moving through a drill. Then she spotted movement, one figure giving orders near the rear. The man from before emerging from the smoke, alive against all odds again. He raised his hands, signaling his men, and in that instant, she understood he wasn't running from them. He was controlling them. The colonel swore under his breath, realizing the trap they had walked into, the entire scene staged to draw her out to confirm she was still alive. He grabbed her arm, saying, "They need you off this grid now." But she shook him off, her voice low and calm. "I end this, or it never ends." Her scope found the man again as the moonlight caught the metal insignia on his chest. Not a mark of rank, but a seal, one that didn't belong to any branch she knew. She adjusted for distance, for wind, and for the lies that had carried them both here. Below, the convoy spread out, taking positions. Aiming toward the cliffs, they had found her nest. The first round from her rifle cracked through the silence again, a single deliberate shot that cut the night clean, the lead vehicle's gunner falling before he could return fire. The colonel moved. Beside her, calling in coordinates on the radio, now alive with static and broken commands, but no one answered. He realized they were too far out of range. They were on their own. Another explosion rocked the valley, the flash lighting her face as she reloaded, her hands fluid and practiced. The man below was shouting now, his voice rising through the chaos, calling her name, not her rank, not her code name, her real name, the one only he should have known. The colonel watched her expression shift, the faintest flicker of recognition or disbelief, but she didn't lower the rifle. The man stepped forward, unarmed, illuminated by the burning wreck behind him, his voice calm, almost resigned. He said, "You never missed, did you?" The colonel looked at her, knowing that. The colonel sat in his quarters long after the lights in the hangar had dimmed, the soft hum of the bass settling into the quiet rhythm of night. The report sat open on his desk, its pages yellowed at the edges, its classification still marked in. Red, he ran a finger down the lines that told her story in clipped phrases, the kind used when truth had to be hidden between words. There was no name, no coordinates, only a mission number and the confirmed range, 2850 meters. The deeper he read the height, more the unease grew, pressing like static at the back of his skull, because buried beneath those cold words was something alive, something that didn't fit the simplicity of success. He pored over the coordinates that had been redacted, cross-referencing old mission maps until a pattern began to form. The valley marked in the file wasn't a random target zone. It was a ghost region, one they'd used years ago for black operations, deniable even to higher command. The details matched too perfectly. To dismiss a commander, eliminated, a mission erased, and a sniper extracted under sealed orders. Yet the more he pieced together, the more it felt deliberate, as if someone had wanted the legend to remain half-remembered, buried, but never gone. He looked up from the file, his thoughts circling the quiet woman in the hangar and the realization that she was the last living proof of something they'd buried for a reason. Outside, the wind swept against the metal siding, a low whistle threading through the darkness. The colonel's radio crackled faintly before returning to static, and in that flicker he felt the same unease he'd known years ago in the field, that sixth sense soldiers never fully lost. He reached for the file again, but the page he needed most was gone, ripped cleanly from the binder. Someone else had been here, someone who still cared enough to keep secrets locked. He leaned back the chair, creaking, his eyes narrowing, because this was no accident. And if she was still carrying that rifle openly, it meant something was moving again. The next morning came slow, the base waking with the sound of engines and orders shouted across the yard. The colonel moved through the hangar deliberately, his boots sharp against the concrete. But when he reached the bench where the Chaytak had rested, it was gone. The space was clean, wiped down, and empty as if it had never been there. He scanned the hangar quickly, recruits in drills, mechanics at work, but no sign of her. He felt the knot in his gut tighten, the air thick with the same silence that followed the end of missions gone wrong. It wasn't absence. It was preparation, and he knew she hadn't left quietly. She had left with purpose. Her quarters were bare, the bunks stripped, the locker open but untouched, as if she hadn't lived there at all. The only thing left behind was a small folded piece of paper resting on the desk. No signature, no insignia, just a single phrase written in black ink where they fell. I rise. He. Read it twice. The words heavy. The meaning unmistakable. She hadn't run, she was answering something, and whatever it was, had been waiting for her call. The colonel pocketed the note, his instincts already calculating the unspoken orders he'd have. To issue and the rules he'd have to break by midday, he was in the operations tower watching the radar sweep across the screen, the green arc cutting slowly through airspace. The officer on duty reported an unscheduled aircraft at low altitude, moving west, fast too small to be tagged as transport. The colonel didn't need confirmation the size and speed matched the Chaytax deployment carrier, a specialized recon bird used by snipers for deep field observation. He didn't announce. It to the others only turned and left the tower without a word. His mind racing with the same thought repeating she was back in the field. But whose orders was she following? He drove out to the perimeter where the desert stretched wide under a blinding sky, the wind cutting across the sand in thin, sharp waves. The hum of engines faded the air still and dry. He remembered the valley, the coordinates from the file, and realized she wasn't retracing her steps. She was closing a loop unfinished from years before. The shot had ended a mission, but not the war behind it, and now she was hunting the shadow that had survived its own death. He felt the old tension rise again, that instinctive awareness that legends only reappear when ghosts demand. Reckoning. By the time he reached command, his inbox was already flooded coded messages from higher divisions, each one vague but urgent. A name had resurfaced, a target marked as eliminated years ago, in the same valley she had once turned into a grave. The mission she had completed had been flawed, the kill uncertain, the confirmation falsified. He stared at the transmission data, cross-checking it with the classified report from his desk, and the conclusion hit him cold. Her shot had ended the wrong man, and the one meant to die had lived. The colonel closed the screen slowly, his reflection staring back at him in the glass, and in that silence he understood what she was doing. She wasn't defying orders. She was correcting them, and no clearance or chain of command would stop her. The 2850-meter mark wasn't just a distance, it was a burden, a point on the map where precision had failed and ghosts had lingered. She was going back to finish what had been left undone, and somewhere in that desert, her rifle would speak again, and the world would listen whether it wanted to or not. The colonel straightened slowly, his breath steady, the hum of the bass fading behind him as he turned toward the door. He knew he had to find her before others did, before the silence of her mission turned into another story buried in reports and erased from memory. He walked through the corridors, the weight of command pressing on his shoulders, his mind tracing the same path through the desert that she had already taken, knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon, the past was waiting to unfold again. The colonel moved through the heat of the desert, his boots sinking into the sand, each step heavier than the last, the horizon shimmering in, waves of gold and dust. He carried nothing but his field radio, his sidearm, and the torn piece of paper she had left behind where they fell. I rise. The words burned through his thoughts with each mile he covered beneath the endless sky. The sun beat. Down on his neck, the wind dry against his skin, and in the distance the faint echo of engines whispered across the dunes. He stopped and scanned the emptiness, knowing she was somewhere ahead, hidden in the folds of the earth, like a ghost waiting for the wind to shift. He remembered her first mission, the one no one spoke about the night she had taken the 2850-meter shot that made her a legend. She had been younger then, quiet and unshaken, even as others doubted the range. They said the shot was impossible, that the wind and the curvature of the valley would scatter the round. But she had studied it for days, waiting for the precise moment when the earth would still. She had pulled the trigger without hesitation, the sound rolling through, the mountains like thunder. And when the dust cleared, there had been silence, absolute and final. Yet even in that silence, the colonel had seen something in her eyes. Not triumph, but a question. She never asked a truth she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Now, as he crossed the ridge, he felt the same question rising again. Was she chasing redemption or revenge? The trail she had left was faint tire tracks pressed into the sand, leading toward a ravine carved deep into the desert floor. The colonel, crouched near the edge, his eyes tracing the narrow pass below a place perfect for a sniper, perfect for one who preferred to wait unseen. He adjusted the binoculars, scanning the valley, and there it was, a small glint of metal, a reflection that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The Che-Tak M200, she was already set up in position. He called into the radio, his voice low, requesting a perimeter check. No response, only static. He tried again, the same silence filling the air. It wasn't malfunction, she was blocking the frequency, intentionally cutting off communication so no one could interfere. That confirmed what he already knew. She was operating alone without authorization, and whatever her objective was, it would end tonight. The colonel slid down the slope, the sand shifting beneath his boots, the sun falling behind the cliffs as shadows began to stretch long and thin across the ground. He found the remains of an old supply post, half buried in the sand, rusted metal, and shattered glass, scattered among the rocks, the remnants of an old war forgotten by command, but not by those who had fought it. The wind carried the faint smell of oil and dust, and something else smoke, faint and deliberate. Someone had built a small fire not long ago. He knelt beside it, tracing the ashes warm to the touch, meaning she couldn't be far. He looked up, scanning the ridges again, his pulse steady, the silence pressing harder with every second. She was hunting something, and he was close enough now to be caught in it. As night fell, the desert transformed, the temperature dropping, the stars sharp and cold above him. The colonel moved carefully, his steps slow, his breathing shallow. He could almost feel her presence in the dark, that calm, still focus that only snipers possessed. Then a sound cut through the silence, a single metallic click, the soft, deliberate sound of a bolt sliding into place. He froze, his instincts screaming, but he didn't reach for his weapon. Instead, he looked up toward the ridge, knowing she was there, watching him through her scope, waiting for him to make the wrong move. He spoke quietly, not to the wind, but to her. I know what you are doing, and I know why, but this won't bring him back. The words drifted upward, carried by the still air for a moment. There was no response. And then a faint light flashed once near the ridge, a signal deliberate, measured 3 short pulses, 1 long, the old sniper code acknowledgement. She had heard him, and she was still listening. The colonel's boots echoed through the concrete corridor of the hangar, his steps measured, sharp and unyielding. The air smelled of gun oil and dust, the faint hum of generators vibrating through the steel walls. Rows of weapons lined the benches, each tagged and cataloged except for one resting alone under the flickering light, a Che-Tak M200. Intervention matte black, the scope glinting faintly from the single beam above it. He slowed only slightly, his eyes scanning the serial markings before, dismissing it as another piece of hardware, yet something about the angle, the balance, the placement felt wrong, as if the rifle itself was waiting for recognition. He continued walking toward the far end of the hangar where the new recruits waited, at attention, their uniforms crisp and untouched by mud or fear, but his gaze kept flicking back the Che-Tak, sitting in silence as though daring him to ask whose it was. He turned his head, finally curiosity pricking his rigid discipline. The rifle was too clean, too precise to be just another issued weapon, and the faint engraving along the barrel caught the weak light, almost calling him back. He stopped mid-stride, his heartbeat slowing in rhythm with the hum of the generators, his instincts, whispering that whoever owned that weapon had written their story in blood and distance. At the far end of the room, a figure stood apart from the rest, a woman in desert fatigues, hair tied back, tight sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the edge of a unit patch, not standard issue. Her hands were clasped behind her back, her eyes fixed not on him, but on the weapon across the room, as if she could feel the weight of his curiosity. She didn't move, didn't speak, and yet the space between them seemed to hum like static. He recognized the posture. Calm, unshaken, that kind of composure was earned, not taught. He turned toward her steps, steady eyes narrowing as he approached the truth, forming but not yet spoken. The recruits shifted slightly, uncomfortable under the weight of silence. The colonel's gaze locked on the woman, her name barely visible on the faded tag across her chest. Major E. Rhine. He remembered the name vaguely from after-action reports, classified ones that rarely left. Command desks, reports that mentioned impossible distances, a kill confirmed at 2,850 meters under wind conditions no one should have taken a shot in. He stopped in front of her, her expression unreadable. Her eyes flicked once toward the Chaytak, then back to him. No salute, no words, just waiting. And that silence held a kind of authority he hadn't felt in years. The colonel's jaw tightened, his gaze darting briefly to the rifle, then back to her. He had seen thousands of soldiers, hundreds of snipers, but this one was different. The quiet around her carried gravity. Her presence wasn't boastful yet. It drew the room inward. Every young recruit standing taller, sensing the current that ran through command without needing to name it, he opened his mouth to speak, but stopped, the words dying on instinct because the silence between them already spoke louder than any question could. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, though no one else dared to breathe, as if the air itself was, holding its breath waiting for what came next. The Chaytak glinted again, catching the weak light just enough for the engraved markings to reveal something more. Just beneath the scope, a small metallic emblem set into the stock, a badge shaped like a crosshair and etched with a single number, 2850. The colonel froze for the first time in years, the calculation immediate, no windage, no drift, that was the shot distance of legends and myths whispered in training halls, a mark only earned by those who had done the impossible. The recruits hadn't noticed, but he had, and his pulse quickened, not with fear, but disbelief, because such precision was near inhuman, and only one soldier in his career had ever carried that range on her record. She met. His eyes without moving her face, calm, her gaze sharp and unblinking as if reading his thoughts before he even formed them. The hum of the hangar seemed to fade, the sound of the distant machinery dulling beneath the weight of realization he took. A step closer, his voice low-controlled, asking the question, though he already knew the answer. The woman didn't reply. Not immediately, only turned her head slightly toward the rifle, a silent acknowledgement like a confession without words. The colonel's heart pounded slow and heavy, each beat counting the years of command decisions and names long buried until now. She finally spoke, her voice steady, almost casual, saying only that the rifle wasn't regulation anymore, that it had seen its last shot, in a valley where wind didn't obey charts and targets didn't wait. Her words carried the weight of ghosts, each syllable drawing the recruits closer without a single movement. She didn't explain the badge, didn't have to. The colonel understood, too well. What kind of record left such a mark? The room felt smaller, the air tighter, the hum louder, and for the first time in a long while he felt that familiar rush, not of command, but of awe, of witnessing someone who had done what logic said was impossible. The colonel turned toward the rifle once more, the emblem glinting faintly now under the steady hum of the lights. The Chaytak sat quiet, its barrel pointed toward the far wall, yet it seemed alive, a silent witness to stories untold. He didn't touch it, didn't need to. He knew the distance, knew the shot, knew the cost that came with numbers like that. and as he looked back at her, he realized she wasn't just another name on a roster. She was a reminder of what it meant to be forged in the chaos of war and to come out carrying silence instead of pride. The recruits watched their commander, their expressions shifting between confusion and reverence, none of them understanding fully what they had just witnessed, but the colonel did. He straightened slowly, nodding once, not in approval, but in acknowledgement of something that couldn't be trained or ordered or replicated. Her gaze stayed level, her presence unshaken, and as he turned to leave, the sound of his boots faded once again across the hangar, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than any words could, and behind him, beneath the flickering light, the Chaytak M200 weighted the badge, glinting faintly in the dim air, a single number carved in steel, carrying the echo of a shot that should never have been possible. The night had been windless but cold, the kind of stillness that carried unease through the valley. Her breath had fogged the scope with every exhale, and her fingers had grown stiff despite. The gloves, the Chaytak M200, rested on the rock before her, its bipod pressed into frozen dirt, and the world beyond her scope looked endless but silent. The distance was impossible, the target only a shimmer of heat in the dark, her spotter whispering, ranges that didn't make sense yet. She said nothing. The radio had gone dead minutes earlier, her ears catching only static and the faint thrum of helicopter blades somewhere too far to help. She had been alone when she took the shot. No backup? No. Second confirmation. Just wine charts written in dirt, and a gut feeling honed by years of breathing between heartbeats. The target was moving a convoy hidden by the curve of the valley, a commander that Intel had said couldn't be reached by artillery. Her cheek pressed against the stock, her pulse syncing with the heartbeat of the weapon, her breath slowing until the world narrowed to a single line. The trigger broke like glass, a whisper more than a sound. The bullet cutting the air before thought could catch up. She didn't move, didn't blink, just listened for the echo that never came, only silence. The impact came long seconds later, a faint puff of dust on the far ridge barely visible through the shimmer of heat. She waited 1 second, then 2, until the bodyguards began to scatter too late to understand what had happened. She lowered the rifle slowly, her breathing shallow, her spotter whispering numbers that didn't seem real. The shot had traveled nearly 3 kilometers across, broken terrain through thin mountain air, and yet it had hit exactly where she intended. She didn't celebrate, didn't smile, only sat there watching the dust drift in the still air, the magnitude of what she had done, settling like frost on her skin. The extraction took hours, the sun rising over the ridges casting pale gold across the valley. The helicopter came in low, kicking up sand, her rifle strapped to her back like a relic. Her commanding officer had said nothing, only looked at the data recorded from her Chaytak, and then back at her with eyes that held more question than praise. The report was filed, classified, the mission name, redacted even from most of the brass. She was told not to speak of it, not to mention the range, not to acknowledge the distance at all. The silence was her commendation, her record erased by design, yet etched in her bones. Weeks later, the nightmares started, the valley replaying itself in fragments, the silence after the shot louder than the rifle itself. She would wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding as if still on that ridge, hearing the wind that hadn't blown the night she broke the impossible distance. Each morning, she'd clean the rifle methodically, disassemble, polish, reassemble, until her hands stopped shaking. Her unit was redeployed, but she was pulled from rotation under the guise of reassignment. Though everyone knew the truth, no one wanted the sniper who'd hit a ghost shot on their team. The burden of perfection carried its own isolation. The colonel had seen her file years later, one among dozens, but that number, 2850, had lingered in his mind as an anomaly, a legend whispered in quiet corners of training halls. It was said the sniper who took that shot retired soon. After disappearing into routine assignments far below her caliber and now standing before him, she fit the silhouette of myth turned flesh. Her calm, the silence, the lack of pride, all of it aligned with the kind of soldier who'd seen too much and spoken too little.